Are you able to kind of ascertain what might have gone wrong?
I think there's two major factors here in relation to the NHS more broadly. First of all, it's very much built to serve the staff rather than the public. And so we have an NHS that's more interested in the ambulance drivers, the paramedics, the nurses and the doctors than it is designed to serve the public. And I think that's one major problem. The other significant problem is the population. We have a far too big a population for the infrastructure. That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
And I think we talk about there being about 60 odd million people in the country. Research really shows there's probably nearer to 72 million people in Britain this day and age, and they're calling on an infrastructure, in this instance ambulances, that just can't cope with the demand. I mean, that's the reality of it. And it was interesting, you talked about when you were younger, and I agree with your analysis. You know, we always expected the ambulance to come. Yep. It's fair to say that they had ambulance drivers there, not paramedics. So they just had people who literally drove vans and then put you into the back of the ambulance. So things have changed quite a bit.
True.
But the development of paramedics clearly isn't enough. With overpopulation, we need to reduce the population, really. And people are making greater demands on the service. People are getting older as well. And the infrastructure just isn't there. It hasn't been, you know, government have allowed people to come into this country in massive proportions, but they haven't built the infrastructure, whether it's hospitals, ambulance services, roads or housing, to cope with the demand that's been created by these governments.
Well, let's have a reminder what Wes Streeting, he's the Health Secretary, said while speaking. He went to see the London ambulance service. Here's what he said.
The NHS is going through what is objectively the worst crisis in its history. And whether it's people struggling to get access to their GP, dialling 999 and an ambulance not arriving in time, turning up to A&E departments, waiting far too long, sometimes on trolleys in corridors, all going through the ordeal of knowing that you're waiting for a diagnosis that could be the difference between life and death.
And the problem is, Simon, I no doubt that Streeting is as aware as we are of this problem, but how does he solve it?
Oh, it's not easy, is it?
No.
And a lot of it went wrong during the pandemic, I think it's fair to say. If we recall, under Tony Blair, the NHS did make some significant improvements in terms of addressing people's waiting times, but that's all gone backwards ever since the pandemic. And we really don't have an NHS that is fit for purpose. I mean, it's going to be a real challenge for Wes Streeting to even make incremental change. He's suggesting that they have a target of treating somebody within 18 hours, as though that's something we should be celebrating. You sat there for 18 hours, and that's what they're hoping to achieve. I mean, it's incredible, really. Absolutely.
We're going to continue with that story with lots of calls coming up as well. Let's go to the other big global story at the moment. President Assad has gone from Syria. His reign, his family's reign, I think about 50 years they were between them running that place, not in a particularly savoury manner, as we know. He's now been granted asylum, what a surprise, in Moscow on humanitarian grounds. You can't make this stuff up. Following the end of that 13-year civil war, 500,000 people dead. Keir Starmer has welcomed the defeat of the Assad regime. Let's have a listen to what the Prime Minister said.
Well, it's very early days at the moment. We do need a political solution to this, and that's what we're talking to regional allies about. It is a good thing that Assad is gone, a very good thing for the Syrian people. What we must also ensure as we go through this, the rejection of terrorism and violence, that civilians are protected, minorities are protected, and that can only be through a political process. That's what we're talking to allies in the region about at the moment.
Now, of course, it should be said, Simon, it shouldn't need to be said out loud because I think most people are aware of this. Yes, great, the Assad regime has been toppled, but when you've been toppled by an Islamist group, then that does raise as many questions that we're going to have to look at going forward.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a very complicated picture. Everybody's pleased that Assad has Assad has gone, but it's what replaces it. We have to be careful what we wish for. And extremist Islamist groups running Syria creates instability in the region as well. You've got to feel for Israel in all of this. They've got a real challenge on. These are on their doorstep. They're fighting on a couple of fronts already, and now they've got Syria being destabilised. So it is a critical point. I mean, we see Starmer there. It's interesting. He's out of the country again, isn't he? I've seen him more on planes than I have in Parliament in the last 5 months. He's now in the Middle East. But and we will be interested in what Starmer has to say, but very few others will. I mean, the more he trots round the globe, the more Britain is being diminished in the world. Yep. He's tried to give away the Chagos Islands. He hasn't supported Israel half enough as what he should have done. He's let extremist Islamists run wild in the United Kingdom. I mean, he's not been good news for our status abroad, and I think he's insulted Donald Trump, the future president of the United States. I mean, foreign affairs for our country is a real problem under Starmer, actually.
Yeah, I sense that too.